Hey everyone, welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy, I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. Oh boy, today's episode, very excited for this guest, John Allison. And if you don't know who John is, why don't I read you his bio right now. Eisner Award-winning comics creator John Allison started creating webcomics in 1998 with Bobbins, a series which ran on the early webcomics portal KeenSpot. When Bobbins ended, he followed that up with Scary Go Round and then Bad Machinery. In 2013, John pitched a spin-off from Scary Go Round, Giant Days, to Boombox, a newly formed imprint of Boom Studios for established artists outside the comics industry. In 2016, Giant Days was nominated for 2 Eisner Awards and 3 Harvey Awards, and in 2019, it won 2 Eisner Awards for Best Continuing Series and Best Humor Publication. The success of Giant Days led to further work with independent presses. John went on to write the series by night for Boom Studios and is now writing and drawing Steeple for Dark Horse. So, I really love the podcast House to Astonish, which is hosted by 2 Scottish lawyers, which you might not think. You're like, wait, 2 Scottish lawyers hosting a comic book podcast, House to Astonish. But they really know the comics industry in and out. And one of the things I love about their show is that they are really good at being able to explain why, how business decisions or decisions about intellectual property affect the stories that people are telling in comics. So I highly recommend it. But every year, at the end of the year, the beginning of the next year, they do a year-end wrap-up where they give out awards to their favorite comics. And for years, they kept giving awards to Giant Days. And so last year during Quar, after the initial excitement of being inside all the time wore off, and the real depression and the long expanses of time started to crush my brain. I guess that's a good way of saying it. I was like, well, why don't I check out Giant Days? And I read the first collection, and I was like, oh, this is great. And then I devoured the rest of the series during Quar. I think I finished, maybe like a month before they announced that I could get a vaccine here in Los Angeles. I gotta say, it's one of the things that saved me during the pandemic. It's great. Well worth your time. I'm going to check out John's other stuff. And so I reached out to John, and he's as nice as funny as you might think the writer of Giant Days would be. So I hope you like this episode. If you do and you want to check out other episodes of Beginnings, I've been doing this show for 11 years, and I've talked with hundreds of artists and writers, performers, musicians, thinkers, etc., etc., etc. What I like to do in the beginning here is a little recommended if you are here because of John and because you like comic books. Maybe you'll like these other episodes I did where I talked to comics creators such as Rob Guillory, Cy Spurrier, Michael Kupperman, Chris Claremont, Jackson Public, Sina Grace, Magdalene Visaggio, Charles Sewell, Lisa Hannawalt. Check out those episodes. If you like what you hear, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, what else? Google, Amazon/Audible, anywhere you get podcasts, I guess, pretty much. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Andy Beckerman, and oh boy, some great episodes coming up, including Lou Barlow from Sebadoh and Dinosaur Jr., Steve Eilert, wonderful writer, also British, if that makes a difference. If you're like, oh, I only listen to when Andy has British guests on. Terry Riley, the, I would say, paradigm-changing 20th century composer. Isabel Campbell from Belle and Sebastian. She's going to be on soon. And, Robert Popper. That's coming up. Robert Popper, one of my favorite, I was going to say British writers of TV and creators of TV, but I just, I don't have to put a nationality qualifier on that. One of my favorites, period. So stay tuned for those episodes. But for now, let's talk to John.
I've tried to make myself look nice for you, just in case you wanted to keep the video, maybe just take some stills and do a gallery show, something like that, of my office's filthy carpet.
Well, this is your evening, so
it is.
In the quarantine, I'm not showering until like late into the day.
I attempt to maintain, like the English gentleman's lifestyle that you would hope for. So I do try and do everything the same time I used to do it in the before times,
So is that British culture, or is that you specifically? Or is that you adhering to British culture?
British culture's a trash fire. I mean, oh God. Yeah. No, it's just me. I'm just great, basically. I can't help it. I'm just incredibly efficient.
It's funny that every time that I talk to someone from the UK and I talk about like all the great things, all the great culture, I realize that we only get the best stuff. Only the best parts of the UK filter over to America. And
absolutely, as it should be.
I don't have a full picture of what British culture is like, really.
Well, all the things that you like, Hugh Laurie and Cat Deeley, all the bits we send over are the people who've managed to like break the force field, and then eventually we recall them back to the mothership. When they've started to look a bit craggy and no longer attractive enough for American television. But yeah, it's obviously there's a steaming heap of terrible stuff. But it's the same with Americans. Actually, no, we get everything from America now, virtually. Like the great cultural imperial project of swamping us, which started in about 1980, is fully complete.
Actually, do you get when I meant the best stuff, I literally meant like Robert Popper and Peter Serafinowicz. I meant like the Giant days, for example. I meant like the coolest, funniest, most interesting stuff filters over to us, and I don't see like 2 pints and a packet of crisps. I don't see like
full marks for bringing up what remains fully an episode of 2 pints of lager and a packet of crisps is fully the worst thing I've ever seen on television. There's a musical episode which is so diabolical that it's like spoken about in whispers, like people meeting pub car parks and pass DVDs back and forth just to burn them.
So but like America exports its worst stuff. Like I don't know if you get the most interesting, coolest stuff from America.
We do. Now, we get like the IFC. We get Comedy Bang Bang and things like that. It shows up on Netflix, and we get all the good stuff. But because we only used to have 4 channels, so we'd only get the best. And we can talk about this when we're talking about what started me off, because that's kind of what started me off, was only getting the best American stuff. But now, because we have so many channels, they have to fill them all through the day with like, American trash pickers, American trash finders, American dumpster lovers, and it's just this wall of programming, and it's an incredible industry that just produces hour after hour after hour of 2 people sitting with their hands on their hips next to a dumpster going, what are we going to find in this dumpster? Say, I don't know. Here's Gary on his motorbike. And like, we get Guy Fieri. Actually, I like Guy Fieri, I'll be honest with you. I think he is actually the good end of American culture. But then we get like, American Prairie Woman, who's, just like kind of a TV chef who's mainly distinguished by wearing a lot of like plaid. Yeah.
We're fully like, 2 years away from reality show competitions being just like exactly what you see in dystopian movies.
Oh yeah, but we always talk about Idiocracy being like, when we watched it was like, Idiocracy. Oh, that could never happen. And within about 10 years, half of Idiocracy had happened, hadn't it?
Yeah, that was like that was like 2018. Like, we're fully past that at this point.
Yeah, I don't like that. Whenever I think about Idiocracy, which I've not watched recently, but because I'm too frightened to. I remember really enjoying it, but at the same time, because I really like Mike Judge. But, oh boy.
Yeah, I think you and I are close to the same age. I don't know. I could not find any biographical information about you online. You are very good at hiding.
I'm 44.
Yeah.
So
we're pretty close. You're just a little older. So you grew up in Thatcher's
Britain, yes.
And I grew up in Reagan's America.
I remember it well, yes. They were good friends, those two. Special relationship.
So did you think, like, I fully thought, I grew up with enough self-awareness to know that things were going downhill, but I really did not think it would go downhill in my lifetime. I was like, oh, dystopia's coming. Like, if everyone follows, like, this neoliberal path, it's not going to go well, but I'll be dead by that time.
Yeah, of course. Well, the thing is that Britain in the late 70s and up to the mid 80s and almost into the late 80s was a dystopia in a lot of ways. Like, Britain was a failed nation, basically, having to be bailed out by the International Monetary Fund. We were in serious trouble. So my girlfriend, who's a bit younger than me, she would ask me over the last sort of 5 years, is this the worst you can ever remember it being? And I go like, oh no, I remember the poll tax riots, when like the government like couldn't like get like property taxes off people. People would just, because the tax was unfair, people were just rioting in the streets and like going scofflaw on it. And I was like, no, that was pretty bad. And I said, I remember the IRA bombings, on the mainland. And it's like, I remember that was really bad. And then it got to like sort of 2018. And she'd like, was this, she would look to me for reassurance. I can't give you reassurance anymore. I think this might be the worst I can ever remember it being.
Yeah. So we're fully living in this reality now. Wait, where did you grow up?
I grew up in the north of England, so proper like kind of Yorkshire moors. I grew up in a country village. I went to school. My dad would drive me to school in the mornings. He like worked in like the local magistrate's court. So it was like a rural upbringing, really, a small town, very picturesque. I was kind of a country mouse, really. I relied on TV and my own imagination for entertainment in Thatcher's Britain of the 1980s. Yeah.
I mean, did Thatcher, like, again, I get a thin version I have a thin understanding of like what actually happened in the UK during the 80s. I just like coal miners or like whatever.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, which is how it's sort of still fed out to us. Yeah. Coal miners. Yeah, the miners went on strike. There was a lot of union busting. All our industries, basically, our heavy industries, were kind of closed down or sold off. All our sort of nationally owned, like the water companies and the electric companies and the gas companies, all the government-owned stuff was all sold off. And it was a time, a lot of people got rich through that, It wasn't like Russia in the 1990s. It wasn't like fully, like gangsters took control because they kind of sold it to the public. But it was something where there was a boom, and then obviously there was a bust almost straight afterwards. So, there was a lot of aspirationality kind of appeared in the late 80s and into the 90s. And then you ended up with the 90s. It was kind of like a reaction against the Thatcher era in culture first and then in politics.
Yeah. Did that touch, like, did you see anything changing around you when you're growing up? Or is
God,
it?
Yes.
How?
You watched a Britain disappear. Like, you watched the kind of 1970s depressed Britain, which was marked by... I'd look at the employment numbers on the news, because my mum always had like the news on, and even though it was only on for an hour a day, she would always watch it. So, and it would be like unemployment's going up, interest rates are going up, inflation's going up, and it was like, oh God, the country's in trouble, and I'm going to be, have to worry about this in about 7 years. I'm 11. What am I going to do in this ever, shrinking world? But things did get better, because they kind of deregulated the money markets. Basically, Britain could make money in the stock markets, like London became very, very powerful as a sort of engine of Britain's economy. And so all of a sudden there was a new prosperity. in Britain, and you suddenly realised that things were actually kind of on the up, and there was an optimism, but also there was this great hatred of the Conservative government, which fueled the arts and comedy and everything else. And this sort of groundswell of stuff that had come up in the 80s of sort of hatred of the Conservative government, all those people kind of graduated onto mainstream television at once, and you had this very, very exciting comedy scene, and music reflected it and everything else. So there were, in the arts, it was a real boom time, the 1990s, when I was coming of age.
Yeah. It was the same here too. Like I didn't really, I had this inkling that things were going to go downhill, but things were not downhill yet. Or at least if you grew up I grew up middle class, and things were still fine up until about 2008.
Yeah, like I remember, like there was always optimism. Like you could still kind of, because scenes were very, what's the word I'm looking for here? You had to work hard to find your people, and then you clung to them, and you had to work hard to find your art, and then you clung to it. So you kind of made your little world, and you held on to it really tight, and it felt kind of comforting in a way that things now feel so transitory, that things could just blow apart and atomize at any moment.
Yeah.
Whereas then you really felt like, if you liked the kind of like this band could be your life type bands, the Husker Do's and the REMs and stuff, that was a real world. And if you found people who liked that stuff too, you clung to them, and that was your strong little universe, and you all knew you had to hold on to each other, because you were never going to find anybody else who liked that stuff outside your small circle of friends pre-internet.
Yeah. I mean, was that you? Like were there certain bands, or were there certain TV shows or comics or something that you built a community around, or found people to...
I was very isolated because I grew up in a village in the countryside, and I went to school away from the village. So I basically moved away from my friends at school, who I'd had until I was about 11. And I went to like what was called a grammar school. It was basically like it wasn't a paid for school, but you had to do an examination at 11 to go in. It's a bit like a magnet school or something like that, where you have to pass a test to get in, and then you've been streamed in with the slightly brighter kids, I guess, from the surrounding area. So, but I just went into work, so I was kind of like socialised with adults after school, because I just go back to my dad's office and sit there for an hour until he went home from work. And so at school, I had friends who were into like music and stuff, but a lot of it, I was at home on my own a lot, home in the evenings, home at the weekends. I go and see friends, but I didn't have many friends locally. So I created my own universe of like American comics, records that I like, kind of keeping lists of bands and records that I liked, making little zines, like trying to make computer games and stuff like this. A lot of stuff I had to do on my own. I was like a little factory, really, is the best way of putting it. Yeah. So like I had friends who were into the stuff I liked, but I had like a friend who was sort of into comics, and a few friends who were kind of into music. But I think a few of them were as monomaniacal about those things. But I had like a broad church, so I couldn't get monomaniacal about like Dungeons and Dragons or comics, because I was into music as well, and I was into games, and I was into everything. I was a little media node. It seems weird to think back to now. I think as a teenager, I don't understand how I turned into that sort of person at all.
Well, yeah, I found it difficult. I mean, I was about to say I'm trying to like unravel it in therapy, but I don't know if I am. I think I'm just like, this is who I am, right? I'm kind of like dilettantish about a bunch of different things. There's just a bunch of different things I'm interested in, and I like exploring all of those things. And
that's right. It's good, though. That's who you should be. You should be like a guy at a big buffet when you're a teenager. You should be having a bit of everything, you should be trying to find out who you are and what you like. And I think it's not, I'm pleased I've been able to carry that into like my 40s, really, because I think a lot of people aren't able to do that. They kind of get locked into things.
Yeah, but yes. So, and it's interesting how on one end, like I refer to, even though I do write, even though I'm a professional writer and I do a lot of other stuff professionally, that I call myself dilettantish. I could call myself a Renaissance man. I mean, if
exactly.
I really want. But there is this, like, it feels that, and maybe this is just American culture, and we have a particularly psychopathic kind of culture. But like you have to you do this one thing, you do it for 30 years, and you retire, and this is the voice you have to have.
Yeah. Well, it's funny when I first started meeting American people, once I got into making comics, like the industry was so small in Britain and was particularly small when I sort of got into making comics properly, that I had to like make American friends to find out how things were done, because there was nobody left in Britain. Like one generation, the kind of Deadline Tank Girl generation, had kind of, again, they'd been kind of sucked into the American industry or just given up. And I kind of, in about 1998, kind of emerged. I was like, there is nobody. I can't find anybody who's doing what I'm doing. So I had to look to America. And people were so focused on making a career out of making comics. You know, just make stuff, make money out of this, monetize this. I was like, wow, nobody thinks like this in Britain that I've ever met.
What was your dad's actual job? You said he worked in a magistrate's office?
Yeah, he was like deputy clerk to the justices. Basically, the magistrates are kind of like quasi-judges, you know, but they're lay people who just kind of, you know, judge on matters, smaller matters in the community. You know, they only go up to a certain level of crime. Then, you know, once you get naughtier, you get onto like the district judge or whatever. But the magistrates would deal with, you know, like, you know, shoplifting and traffic offences and things like this, you know, like kind of smaller crimes. And my dad was was deputy in charge of that court, so he'd advise the magistrates and like deal with the paperwork and stuff. So he's kind of like a white collar guy, you know. He hadn't been to university. He'd kind of been doing this, I think, since he was 20. He used to be able to just go in, they'd train you up, you know. He'd just gone into this from being a car mechanic beforehand. That was his job beforehand, and he sort of went for, because he just loved cars. He's still obsessed with cars. That's what he thinks about the first thing when he wakes up every morning. My dad is a car. I'm sure of it. I know that the first thing he thinks of, he's just thinking about a car from 1967, and he sort of shakes his head and goes downstairs and has his bowl of muesli. But so that was his job. It was a white collar job. You're kind of talking the pre-computers age of when I was there. You know, like he still had a typewriter in his office, and he didn't have a computer on his desk until like my late teen years. So it's a sort of different world, really.
Yeah, I was thinking that when you were talking about, you know, 1998 rolling around, and you were looking around for other people for advice or just some kind of like camaraderie. I don't know about you know, how to make comics, and I was like, oh right, 1998, like the internet. You can't get any information. I remember like maybe in the mid 90s was like the first Pavement website, the first where you could download a giant wave file of a single bootleg Pavement song, and there was nothing. You couldn't get any. It was like a couple GeoCities websites, and that was really it.
Usenet was where you would try and find information. So you go on like rec.arts.comics.strips, and there'd be a few like comic strip nerds on there who made their own comic strips. I mean, people who keep a list of like the 10 web comics there were in 1998 or whatever, and you're like, well, I better go and look at these, hadn't I? Because the search engines were terrible. There were very few websites. Like listservs were quite good for bands, so you'd be on mailing lists for your bands. And again, that's another way that I met people in America and kind of thought, yeah, this is actually a world that I can participate in across the sea, was sort of band listservs when I was at university. Because that was where information was. That was where like human resources were, really. Even pre-forums, because I don't think forums were really a thing before about like 98, 99, something like that.
No, yeah, message boards. I'm like, when were the first message? Yeah, like but when I was in college, like midway through collage, where people started really using message boards, and that was it.
Exactly. So you had to. It was kind of like you had to go peer to peer for your information. Really, it was either Usenet or mailing lists. Yeah.
So I mean, that's the thing. You had to really want to talk to people. It wasn't just you couldn't just like type something, like you said. There were. I mean, I don't even know what the search engines were. Like Ask Jeeves or something. Yahoo.
Alta Vista. And,
yeah, right.
And Yahoo and things like that. And there was always one, this one's the best one. Pre-Google, it was always like, this one, it's great. This one's when we can get web crawler. Web crawler's the one. That's got all the information on it. And they were all universally terrible.
Yeah. So you had to like really want to see, like, were you seeking out, I mean, I'm going to give this as a binary, but it might be, more than this. Were you seeking out like just information? Were you seeking out camaraderie as well?
Both, yeah. One, I'd never shown my comics, but again, to maybe the one or two friends I had at school who were interested, the comics that I'd made, which had never been very good, to be honest with you, but I'd never really showed them to anyone, and I would never have scanned the comics I'd made kind of pre my little 1998 personal revolution of really trying hard. I would never have shown them to anyone, and I never have shown them to anyone. But yeah, I was looking like I'd made these strips. I wanted to be like a newspaper cartoonist because that was like the gentleman's cartooning. I wasn't a great story writer, but I'd worked out how you did it. I'd read a lot of Calvin and Hobbes books and Bloom County and things like that. I was like, Joe, I can just about work out the rhythm of this, even though I didn't start off great. But I did like a submission packet of 25 strips, which is how many you had sent it to like King Features and United Features. And United Features, I may have got a 3-line letter back, but King Features sent me back the guy I can't remember what his name was. He was a lovely guy. He wrote back such a detailed note. He died pretty young. He died in like a surfing accident. But and I believe there are still like industry awards named after him. He must have been a great editor to work for because I was so unpolished, and yet he picked out things in my work, what to do, what to stop doing immediately, and said, this is really promising work, send it in again, and I think showing it to him, I was like, well, he didn't think it was that bad. I need to find some more people to show the work to, so and the internet was the only place I could go looking for it because there was no comics community that I could see that I could be a part of. So that was what I did. Yeah. So yeah, it was camaraderie, and it was sort of like professional, not professional's the wrong word, but kind of, mentoring or peer mentoring or whatever you choose to call it, just not to be shouting alone in your room, really.
Yeah. I mean, is that not the modern existential condition?
That's it. Yeah, exactly. You just don't want to be shouting alone in your room, and a lot of time when you're on like social media, you're still shouting to yourself. When I tweet about a record that I really like and it gets 1 like, and I think, do you know what? I spent a long time building up this Twitter following, and only one person could be bothered to like this record, this life-changing piece of art. I'm shouting alone in my room again. It's no different.
My God. There's one thing where like it's so interesting to me about Twitter where like I will tweet just like some like random like when I'm walking the dog I come up with a joke and it does well and I'm like I just toss that off, and then I sit here and I craft a joke. I craft something and it's just like 2 likes, and it is devastating.
It is, because to you, like in your head, in the little theatre of your mind, you can already hear the round of applause before you tweet it, can't you? You're like, oh yes, people are going to love this, I'm going to be walking tall. And then you're like, nah, nobody's even faintly interested in. But of course, you're firing it into a torrent of information. It's like throwing your baby into a river and saying, become the greatest Olympic swimmer. Off you go. It's not really, it may not work. It might work, but it's probably not going to work.
That's what I tell myself. I tell myself when it doesn't do well. I'm like, well, they're just too much information, or I tweeted at the wrong time. Not exactly. That like, maybe it wasn't great.
I've come to appreciate when I have an interaction with a stranger and I manage to get a joke out on the spot that has not been worked out. And I was lining up with a load of people to buy bread at a little sort of hatch. And there was a kind of middle-aged woman waiting next to me with her mask on, and everyone's like trying to stay away from each other, stay socially distanced, say the 2 meters. And the woman says, it's a little bit like country dancing, isn't it? And I don't know what she thought I was going to say. And I just looked at her and I said, yeah, it's a whole lot of do-si-do. And I thought, I enjoyed that. I was really pleased with my little performance for one person. And I got a little wry smile through the mask. And I thought, yes, I've scored with that one. That's 100% of the people I sent that joke to liked it.
Oh, I could feed off that energy for like the entire afternoon.
Oh, I was high as a kite, yeah, on the way home. Just eating that bread as fast as I could.
So this is the thing. I've been thinking about this recently because I saw something on TikTok the other day where I was like, this is so well done. This person is so creative, and they're just doing this as a hobby. And especially living in Los Angeles, I've been thinking about why professionalize in the first place, right? Because I came out here and I realized that 99%, if not almost 100% of this business is run by nepotism. And there is so much creativity. There are so many people doing like high quality creative works, making whatever, music, or that aren't doing professionally, that are just like, hey, I've become incredibly skilled at this thing, and now I just made this 60-second video and I'm sharing it with the world. And I'm kind of curious. It made me really start to think about why people professionalize their creative works. And I'm kind of curious about that with you, especially, as you are, you're doing this as the internet is dawning for real, as it's starting to become this cultural force that takes over everything and changes our entire brains.
Yes. Well, that's it. It's both a prosaic answer, and I'm sure that the longer I talk about it, the more it'll sound like I've got sort of delusions of grandeur. So I studied journalism at university, and I kind of wanted to be like a music journalist, and I worked on like the university paper, and I was music editor of like our online magazine, which was quite a new thing at the time, but was great because we got reps on the record labels would come and they'd take us out and you get gig tickets and stuff, and then I worked for the paper after that in a kind of lesser capacity just to keep writing. But by the time I'd finished university, I kind of didn't want to write about music anymore. I didn't want to write about art. I was pulling things apart, and I was like, I love drawing, I love making things. I don't know if I want my job to be pulling things apart and trying to work out how they work, because it just made me want to make art more. It just wanted to make, reviewing records all the time just made me want to make music. I was not good at making music, but I still learned to play the guitar. I was like, oh, do you know what? If I do this for another 17 years, I might actually become proficient enough to make one song. So I thought, but no, I am actually good at drawing and like writing. So I went back to comics, which I'd done as a kid. And then I got home after college. There were a couple of months where I was looking for a job, and I was still going to get a job in journalism because I'd just done a bachelor's degree. I'd done 3 years. So I thought, well, I'd better get a job in it. So while I was kind of loafing around the house looking like I wasn't really going to get a job, to look busy in front, because my mum and dad were obviously like, mum's there with her arm folded, foot tapping, when's my son going to get out of the house into the world? And so I started making comic strips. I thought, well, I'll do this on the side. I'll see if I can make some strips, because if I can become a gentleman cartoonist like Jim Davis of the Garfield, I will never have to have a job. And this idea in my head, although I got a job after, I guess, 2 or 3 months, it took a while. The jobs market wasn't great at the time, and I couldn't drive, which didn't help for like a journalist job, because a lot of jobs you did need to be able to drive. So, but I kept making the comics after I got a job. I got like a production job, a design job at like a publisher. So I was able to, I didn't have to drive. You don't have to drive anywhere to design things, it turns out. But I thought, no, I like making comics, and I'm going to keep doing it even though I've got a job, even though it means that I'm doing it at the weekends. And the input of work and the amount of time I spent doing it made it important in my life, and I couldn't stop. And then once people started reading it, even if it was only a couple of hundred people at the start, it was like, I've done something here that I don't know anybody who's ever built a little audience of reading stuff. People are actually paying attention to this. And when I've been writing things, I'd done 1 or 2 things where perhaps one person had emailed me to say they liked it. But it was like, I can point to tangible numbers, GeoCities numbers, and say, this is actually being read by people. And it kind of, it was like, I wasn't going to let go of it at that point. Even though I was not a particularly proficient cartoonist, I was very rough, and I'm a slow learner as well, which means that my improvements have been hard won. But I just couldn't let go of it.
I mean, what changed? Because you said earlier that you had not been monomaniacal, that you were kind of, I mean, I'll say Renaissance man-ish when you were younger, right? And you had, like your friends, you said, I think, got monomaniacal about D&D or something like that. Yeah. So what changed in between that and being like, I can't, because I think that's a very common story on here. It's my story too. I can't not do it. I'm compelled.
Yeah, it's time poverty. Like, once I was working, if I was getting to work at 8:30, 9 in the morning and there until 5:30, I didn't have time. I had to choose. I had to pick my horse because I couldn't. Because I tried to do all the different things still. I did little bits of freelance video game writing, and I did, I kept messing around with the music for a while, very, very poorly. But I kept trying to write like little songs and stuff like this, but it was like I could only dedicate my energy to one of these pursuits alongside working a job and attempting to maintain a social life. And I decided it's the comics because that's the only thing I've done where I've proved that anyone's even faintly interested in it, and that changed the complexion of what it was, really.
Yeah. Was this a real existential decision, or was it just you looking around being like, I don't have enough time in the day, I don't have enough energy in my body to do all these different things?
Once I entertained the idea of being a gentleman cartoonist, even though I did set aside the idea of working for newspapers quite quickly, because once I started putting stuff on the internet, it seemed more vibrant. I don't know why I felt that this was something that could work, because there was certainly no money in doing a webcomic at the time. But I could sort of see, I'm losing my thread here a little bit, but yeah, I could see that it would work. I could see that. No, I've forgotten what the question is. Sorry, I'm not sure how to phrase this.
Oh, it was just, I'm just curious if there, when I talk to a lot of people on the show, I get very curious about the existential end of all this stuff, and because I think for a lot of people, the creative stuff is a very deep part of our identities.
Oh, well, I did have an existential moment, and it was a very clear line in the sand. I got to work. I was having to make these comic strips at the weekend, and I thought, I can't do this forever because it will kill me. Because it was hard, Like, I was doing as many strips as a professional would do a week, and I was working at a job. And when you're 22, you've probably got the energy to do that in a way you don't when you're 44.
Yeah.
But I said, I'll give this 5 years from when I start, which would have been, I guess, like the September of 1990. I'll give it 5 years. I'll kind of see what works. If I can do this for 5 years, if it's not worked after 5 years, I'll just stop because this is really hard. And what a number, 5 years. What had I done? I'd never done anything for 5 years in my life, but for some reason that was the number I produced out of my head. And because I was able to show incremental growth, nothing undermined that kind of existential. I was always building in that 5 years. There was never a sense of, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Because webcomics were growing. There was kind of like an engine. There was heat under the old pan. So I was able to keep going, yeah.
Did you have any role models? Did you see this kind of work ethic in your parents? Were there other comics people or people in whatever, music or something that you saw that inspired you in this way?
It's funny. I was a big fan of, there was a radio DJ in the UK called Danny Baker who'd made the fanzine Sniffin' Glue. And Sniffin' Glue was a punk fanzine that he and I think Mark Perry was the guy who'd started it. And then they'd done it out of a bedroom. They just typed it, stapled it, and sold it. And I think they only did 12 issues. And I think by the last issue, I think they sold 20,000 copies of it. And they just stopped because it was getting too hard. And, Danny Baker went to work at the NME and then at the BBC. But I sort of saw that as a model of, if you actually, if you can get people interested and there's some heat behind something, this is kind of what you do. This is how it works. It was kind of like, that's kind of zine culture's, one of zine culture's, I think, biggest ever successes is Sniffing Glue. But obviously it's because punks were so hungry for something to read, there was a huge hunger for it. And that was kind of my model. It's an odd model, but it was a more realistic model because there was no model of how webcomics could work. I could see people who were doing a bit better than me, who'd been doing it for perhaps 6 months longer, and were a little bit more successful and a little bit more driven or whatever. And so I could sort of follow them. There was a guy called John Rosenberg who did a comic called Goats, which was at goats.com. You can see that he'd thought hard because he had a really good domain name. They got in quick on goats.com. And John was ahead of me, and he was very generous with his time and telling me kind of like how they'd done things. And so I could look at John and say, Yeah, so this is the next step you work to. And then I just kind of kept looking for where the next step was, like how you kind of moved into the next little tier, how you either improved as an artist or as a writer, or what kind of steps you had to take, until I started to kind of make them on my own.
Do you mind if I ask, what were those steps?
Well, I mean, it's a long time ago now, but the things that I knew that I had to do was I had to kind of keep momentum, because webcomics were popular with people who were goofing around at work in the pre-social media age, where, you know, it was a way for people to just have free, fun things to read. And also the relationship with comic strips based on newspapers meant that people had relationships with comic strips in those days. So I knew I kind of had to build a relationship like that with my readers. I knew I had to keep the readers once I got them. I sort of knew, I saw what worked in the comic and kind of did more of it. I mean, that was all you could do really when you didn't have a huge amount of experience. And then every time anything worked, you just did more of it. That was the main thing. You know, you tried to stand out. You would try and talk to other creators, like build up your little knowledge banks. But really, the next thing was like kind of linking together, just doing links to other. Isn't this wild? You did links to other comics, and they linked to you, and you created a little, a little ecosystem of comics, and that was kind of what fed webcomics. So yeah, you just built up, and then that was it. You know, you kind of built bigger and bigger networks of people, and then readers began to discover comics that were like the comics that they liked, and that began to professionalize things as the audience kind of cohered into a solid lump, instead of just being a few people at universities reading on their computers. You know, it got out into normie society and people who had computers on the desks at work, and that was when things started to really kind of explode.
I mean, was that the moment? It doesn't have to be a moment, but was that the moment where you realized that this was more than just something you were kind of screwing around with?
Yes, as soon as I could see somebody in the distance who was making money, and that sounds very venal, but making money was basically a sign that you had a big audience, and the big audience was more important than the money, but you kind of can't keep going forever. You need to make money at some point, otherwise you're never going to, live your life if you're spending every weekend just making stuff. So when I could see, it's like a video game where, you have the mist in the distance and you run and run and run and run. Eventually the castle kind of appears and you're like, oh yes, the castle, I've finally made it to the castle. I only got to kill 18 million skeletons and then I'll get to the castle. So once the castle reared into view, and the castle was like comics like PvP or Penny Arcade, where these guys were obviously connecting with people, and my work was more esoteric than theirs. I knew I could never kind of appeal to an audience that broad, but I did know that I was connecting with people in different ways with like character-based comedy and kind of things that I'd learned from TV. And so I knew that was working, and I knew it would never be as big as them, but I also knew that the audience was growing, and if I just kept working at it, I would eventually get into the Misty Castle.
I mean, that's the thing that strikes me so much about Giant Days is how much it feels like TV, right? With you have longer arcs, but then each episode, each issue is self-contained.
Yeah, it's the only comic I think I could have done that with, because it's got quite a simple setup. Like most comics are lagged with plot, There's a lot of devices, and any device is going to eat a few pages of your issue. But with Giant Days, because it just centers around the three characters in a very simple universe, I was able to build a whole plot in an issue around them in a way that meant that I could have an A plot and a B plot. And these were things, again, I'd learned from watching TV in doing the webcomics that I'd done in the past. But they were sprawling, my webcomics, there was no sense of boundaries around how long a story would be. But I'd been practicing all the different little techniques I'd learned from watching seasons and seasons of ER and Seinfeld and things like that. So I was able to kind of use the tools that I'd learned from television. And then I thought, well, I could now produce. When I came to Giant Days, I had a very specific skill set that I could use on that. I'm not saying I could write for TV, because you have to write a lot more words for TV, and I'm quite lazy. I find it very tiring writing. But I knew that I could do a sitcom comic, a comic that worked like a sitcom. And the important thing was just to keep it tight, keep the actual setup really, really tight. And Giant Days was the first thing I came up with that actually would support that tight of a setup.
I mean, you said earlier, going back to the beginning of when we started talking, that American TV had been kind of at the foundation.
Absolutely. Well, there's a different, like, American TV was shown differently in Britain to how it was shown in America. And so shows would only be shown in Britain once the season was complete. Like in America, obviously, like a 22-week season would be broken up by the football 1 week or a mid-season hiatus. Here, it wasn't like that. You'd get it every week. You get 22 weeks of ER, or you get 22 weeks of NYPD Blue or Hill Street Blues or St. Elsewhere, and that kind of repeat hit of 22 weeks of something, long enough in between to want to see the next episode and to kind of digest it, meant that you had a real connection to the series that maybe even American audiences didn't get, because so many more commercials, like the X-Files for the first 7 seasons in the UK was shown without commercials because it was on the BBC, so you were just getting 45 minutes or 50 minutes as it was of the X-Files, and there were never as many commercials there on British TV as there are in America, so we get a much less diluted version of a network TV show, which obviously now with Netflix, now everybody gets TV like that, but at the time, we were getting a slightly purer version of what you were getting of your own shows. So, like, you could build up quite a connection to shows, and I had that connection. My mum and dad loved the American imported shows. They loved, like, Dallas and Hill Street Blues and things like that. And but they loved, like, my dad, like quality stuff. So, like, when those shows were on, the slightly more challenging network shows, he'd watch them, and then when I was old enough to stay up, I'd watch him with them, because I was, I was a good viewer, a good quiet presence in the living room in an evening, So I could hang on quite a long time past my bedtime if I wanted to watch something.
Were these the real points of connection between you and your parents?
I think so. Yeah, I think like I have a good relationship with my parents, and they've never ever questioned the fact that I do a job that I made up myself that didn't exist when I started trying to do it. And I think that's the greatest gift they could have given me. Like, I didn't grow up with a lot of money, but my parents have been enormously supportive in that they've never said to me, "What are you doing? This doesn't make sense." They were always just like, "Yeah, all right. He seems to know what he's doing," and so that and again. It was, though, yeah, because you could talk about it with them. When you're a teenager, you can't talk about anything with your parents. Everything is cripplingly embarrassing, But you can talk about what Sipowicz is up to on NYPD Blue,
yeah.
You've got your characters, you've got your stories, and there's a huge reservoir of connection and shared time there. That even when I go home now, and my parents are in their 70s now, I'll go home. Oh, they'll watch some terrible shows now. They'll watch the real potboiler procedurals. But at the same time, I enjoy watching it with them. And they'll be watching The Mentalist. They'll have gone through it for the third time. And when I was at home at Christmas, I think I watched 14 episodes of The Mentalist with them. And the sheer pleasure of just spending some time with Patrick Jane and his buddies on The Mentalist. It was these are nice times. These are the times I remember, It's pleasant.
Yeah, I mean, I would say even into my 40s, it's still embarrassing to have any deeper conversations with them. But it's still very safe to talk about what movies we just watched. And it's still very safe to talk about the TV shows that we watch in common.
Exactly. And it's, it is. It is a sort of safe share. So that's why I like network TV. That's why I feel like, quality drama, as much as I love shows on HBO and stuff, I'm never going to watch any show with my parents that could feature a blowjob. Ever. Never. Because I don't want to ever have to sort of parse that conversation that might come up. My father kind of slapping his knee. No. It must never be allowed to happen. We're gonna stay in the safe zone of network TV. And so that's why I kind of miss those quality network dramas where you knew you were safe from that. Bad things would happen, but also... there'd be a sort of distinctive kind of Barry Levinson voice or something like that, a kind of creative kind of Stephen Bochco kind of thing that, meant that it was worth watching.
Yeah. No, I remember when I was 16, maybe, Clerks came... Yeah, I had to have been 16. Clerks came out. And I didn't know who Kevin Smith. My parents didn't know. They just knew like, oh, people are talking about this. And I remember because I was 16 because I had a curfew for like you in Pennsylvania. If you had just gotten your driver's license or something, you couldn't drive past midnight. So I remember I had to come back from my girlfriend's house by before, or maybe 11. I don't know. At some point I came back. My parents were like, hey, we just rented this from Blockbuster. You want to watch it? And I go, sure, I'll watch this with you. And we sat there and watched Clerks and didn't utter a sound the entire time because I didn't want them to know I knew what the characters were talking about, and they didn't want to have. I mean, we had one conversation about sex when I was in 5th grade. I asked all my questions, and that was the last time we broached the subject.
Oh boy, Clerks. That's a filthy film. That's
totally.
Yeah. Oh dear. You really, this has quite shaken me, to be honest with you. The thought of you sitting down with your parents and putting Clerks on. I don't know what I would have. To be honest with you, I think I would have stood up. I would have had the courage to sit down. Do you know what, Mum, Dad? I don't think this film's for us.
I didn't have. So they were lying in their bed, and then I was they had like a raised bed, and I was sitting at the foot on the floor of the bed. So I just didn't move a muscle. I didn't make a sound. I didn't laugh at a single joke. I just sat there.
No, you mustn't laugh. No, you must not betray a single moment of mirth. No, definitely not. Oh dear.
Yeah.
Oh God.
So I understand this energy, and this the energy in my family that persists to this day is that energy. Is the very strict like force field, like it's an emotional force field, you know, like on Star Trek or something. It's like whatever the shields are.
Yes,
but for
absolutely.
Our hearts.
Exactly, and it keeps you safe. It keeps the relationship strong. You know, we're not Dutch. We've not been raised just to think of these things as run of the mill. It's fine for like 20 or 30 people just to get shot on TV. That's fine. Any mention of just like adult relations, even slightly left of vanilla, it's like no. Oh no.
Yeah.
No.
My wife and I and our her mom and her mom's husband, we went to Amsterdam like the summer before the pandemic. How long has this pandemic been going on? So 2019, right? Is that right? So the summer 2019 for her mom's birthday, we went to Amsterdam, and I remember us walking past. Like I guess we were just wandering around, and we walked into the red light district, and I was just like walking as fast as possible because I was just like, you know, there are women in this area. It's just like basically sex workers in in windows being like, hey, do you want to come in and have sex with me? And I just like I'm like, please, I don't want anyone to know that I know that sex exists.
Of course. Absolutely. Yeah, you've got to maintain the force field. You've got to raise those shields immediately.
Yeah. So yes. So we have these very happy détentes, emotional détentes with our families that have existed since we were young. And because of that, though, I'm curious, how were you able to learn how to express yourself emotionally? Is it just, do you do that in your regular life? Is it just relegated to your comics?
Well, my house wasn't emotionally tamped down in that way. I mean, it's difficult to explain, but I've always been reasonably comfortable with my emotions. Like, all British people are to an extent repressed, because that was the nature of the culture up until Princess Diana died and opened the floodgates on madness in our national psyche. But it really, yeah... I knew that to be able to talk about how you felt was a balm. You know, like if you could talk to a friend and talk about how they actually felt, you were doing them a service. And if you want, and I'm not a loud person, and I'm not a big talker at a party. But I like to get into the nitty gritty, you know, and find out what's going on with people. And if they're having a hard time, I'm not going to go, okay. I will ask them, you know, and try and, you know, I'll try and find where that pain is, and just let them let a little bit of it out. I don't want them to let all of it out, you know. I'm not Jesus, but I did, you know, and I was interested in how people felt, and if they were having a tough time, I wanted to talk about it. So I've always kind of had that side of me. I am interested in people and their feelings, and if you can, and I always had a sense of if people weren't having a good time, and that it was important for them to be able to talk about that with me if they couldn't talk about it with anybody else.
So you were like that since you were a kid? It was just kind of like an instinct for you?
Yeah, it's just about being nice to people. I mean, obviously, yeah, and I can't, and obviously this didn't really sort of blossom until I was a teenager, but I've always preferred to deal with people one-to-one, you know. Like, so I would go to, like, you know, I go and see a movie with a friend, and you're waiting around beforehand, you just get into stuff with people, and they would have their little problems, and I would find it quite easy to listen to their problems with a sympathetic ear, and just, you know, be someone who wasn't going to judge them for it, if you like. That was it, really. Just, you know, because, you know, I had my problems. Frankly, I wanted to talk about my problems. You've got to earn your corn. You know, you've got to earn your chance to talk about that gal you're unhappy about. But you've got to listen to other people's problems as well. It's not a one-way street.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting, I mean, it may just be my own personal repression. It might be American repression. But, you know, my friends and I would just, when we're sitting around waiting to go see the movie and we're staying in line, we would just quote The Simpsons. We would just like make each other laugh and just like quote lines back to each other and goof around and make jokes as opposed to get into the nitty gritty. Yeah. And that was like really an adult thing that I had to learn in my like late 20s, early 30s.
Well, I went to an all-male school from the age of 11 to 18. So I was in an all-male environment, and I'm not like the most alpha male. So I was in this environment of just kind of like testosterone. It was quite an eccentric school that I went to. It wasn't, you know, but it was like a rugby playing school. It was like a sports school, you know.
Huh.
And so I was around this kind of slightly, you know, febrile masculinity all the time. And by the time, I always liked the friendship of girls and women, and all of a sudden they vanished from my life completely when I was 11. It was like, where was I going to find more girls? You know, I didn't even go on the school bus in the mornings. So in a way, I was kind of trying to create a more gentle environment that often my friends were not receptive to. I had a lot of friends who just wanted to like hit each other like burning embers that we'd got out of the bonfire and stuff, and I'd be like, do you know what, this 100% isn't exactly my kind of thing, you know, where are the girls? I had to wait until I was about like 15 or 16, then girls reappeared, and I was like, oh thank God, the civilizing influence of women. But yeah, so like there was just an absence in my life of a certain sort of emotional literacy, and again I had to kind of fill it myself, really. But you know, I read books. I wasn't just reading books about like eye gouging and stuff like many of my friends, Dean Koontz and the like, mouths full of spiders. You know, I was trying to read widely and kind of learn a bit about human nature.
Wait, what was this? Like the school you said, it was a magnet school, but it's also just a school about football and rugby?
Yeah, that's kind of the way those kind of like, it's basically grammar schools were a system that virtually vanished in Britain. Like you had two choices. You'd either go to, you'd take an exam at 11 and you would either be sent to the school for smart kids, or you'd be sent to the school for all the other kids. But there are only a few of these schools left in the country that aren't paid for schools now. So what this was like an educational relic that was kind of like self-governing, because the ones that decided they wanted to stay as these selective schools were kind of their own thing, and the government would give them the money they'd give like a normal, you know, like public school, but they kind of got to do their own thing. They could, you know, they'd have their own kind of uniforms and they'd have their own rules. That, you know, they couldn't like start flogging you or anything, but they weren't exactly like the other schools. Mm-hmm. I have never really thought about this before, so I'm putting this together on the fly. But they're often like sports based, because all these schools would like play sports against each other, and so you would, you know, and you'd play sports against the paid for schools as well, like the schools where the rich kids went to, and it was, you know, and if we could beat those schools, this was quite the thing. But I was never interested in these kind of elements of life at all. It was a completely alien world, and you felt a little bit undervalued. I was academic, which meant that I sort of thrived at this school. But it was the sort of school where your school, like all the marks for every subject would be like tabulated on the wall, and then it'd give you a rank in your class at the end of the term. So it was competitive. But unfortunately, academically, I was competitive. So I kind of was able to survive in that environment when lots of kids, I think, who were perhaps the way I was, but a little bit meeker, would not have been able to do. Uh-huh. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because the thing that I was really interested in, something that's gone through our entire conversation has been this line where you seem like a person who is assured of himself, or at least has enough self-awareness that you know who you are in some way, and you're not letting these different contexts change you too much.
That's it. The only time I ever let the context change me was when I went to university, and it was like a drinking culture. And Sheffield University that I went to, the one that Giant Days is set at the time, I think it was maybe 3-to-1 male to female, just because it was highly science orientated, a lot of the courses. So it was quite a masculine environment. And I thought, is this how being a college student is? You just drink. And I'm not a good drinker, and I can barely drink at all. I don't really drink anymore, very rarely. But, I kind of got into just drinking. It didn't, and that's the only time I ever lost myself. Because I would go home during the sort of summer break, and I wouldn't drink for those weeks, or just very occasionally, and I'd start to feel like myself again. And then I'd go back, and I would have fun with my friends out of the bars, but I would feel myself start to disappear, like the assured person. So by the end of university, I'd kind of lost myself a little bit in comics, and doing that kind of was how I found myself again and found my people again and all that. I kind of stitched it all back together through doing the comic. I didn't even realize what I was doing, that I was kind of helping myself.
So, I mean, we're right at the end of the show, but was that something you were self-aware about, that you had kind of lost who you were? Or was it just something in the back of your mind that you realized afterwards, after you started making comics, that you're like, oh, I totally lost who I was?
Yeah, I couldn't put it together. I think, a lot of times when you're in a bad mood about something, you'll end up getting a bit snippy in the kitchen with your partner. And she'll say, well, what's the problem? You're like, I don't know. I'm fine. And then you realize about half an hour later, you're like crying. It's like, oh God, oh no, what am I going to do? And you realize you're just not in touch with, whatever kind of part of the animal brain where my problems lie. They're in a kind of lockbox, and then they, you really have to kind of jemmy that lockbox open to actually find them. And it was a macro of that. It was like, I am just not being myself. I'm kind of, my friends are people who in large part are just kind of like having fun in a kind of very normal way, but this isn't me at all. I'm someone who needs to spend a lot of time on his own, making things, kind of digesting the world, and kind of spitting it back out again as art. And I'm not doing this, and I'm not doing this for 3 years, and this is what happens. You feel very, very unhappy at the end of it.
Yeah, that's the kind of like that compelling feeling, because it's just like, if I don't make something for a certain amount of time, I mean, at this point now, it's like, if I go a day or two without making something, I get real like anxious and like jittery, and
you get like verklempt is the word, isn't it? You get like you get like boxed up inside, and there's something that you've got to let it out. And I think for a lot of us, like a kid makes art non-stop. They sit and they generate art constantly, as that's how they kind of process everything. They draw and they make things, and then we stop. And we lose the ability to just let that out into the world. And I think a lot of people, they don't need it anymore. But I think some of us do need it. I think we do need to keep making things, because otherwise we're not processing things, and it's just going in the lockbox and it's not being dealt with.
Yeah, and then we need that screwdriver to pry open.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what art is, whether it's writing or music or drawing or whatever. It kind of like it processes it.
That actually seems like we're at the end, but it also seems like a appropriate place to end. So, great. John, thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was great.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh 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 bye. Bye.